How do you send 80 soldiers to war and bring back 81? Not 80 minus casualties, not 80 with a few missing. 81, one more living, breathing human being than you started with. That is not how war is supposed to work. Wars subtract, they don't add. And yet, in 1866, the tiny principality of Liechtenstein managed to pull off what might be the most absurdly wholesome military outcome in recorded history. Their entire army marched off to fight in one of Europe's major conflicts, fired 0 shots, lost 0 men, and returned home with a new friend. This is that story, and honestly, every part of it is more ridiculous than the last. So the first question we need to answer is this. Why on earth did Liechtenstein, a country you could walk across in a single afternoon, even have a military? We're talking about a nation roughly the size of Washington, D.C., a place wedged between Switzerland and Austria with a population in the 1860s of barely 9,000 people. Why does a country like that maintain an armed force? The answer goes back to the German Confederation. After the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815, the Congress of Vienna redrew the map of Europe, and one of the things it created was the German Confederation, a loose alliance of 39 German-speaking states. This included massive powers like Austria and Prussia, medium kingdoms like Bavaria and Saxony, and then, way down at the bottom of the roster, tiny principalities like Liechtenstein. And every member of the Confederation was expected to contribute to collective defense. Every single one. No exceptions for being adorably small, so Liechtenstein maintained a military contingent of 80 men. That was their entire standing army. 80 soldiers for the whole country. To put that in perspective, that's fewer people than you'd find in a mid-sized restaurant on a Friday night. These weren't exactly battle-hardened veterans either. Liechtenstein was a peaceful Alpine principality. Their soldiers were more accustomed to ceremonial duties and border patrols than anything resembling actual combat. But the Confederation said everyone chips in, so Liechtenstein chipped in their 80 guys, and that was that. Until 1866, when the Confederation actually called in the favor. Here's the next question. What was this war actually about? And how did a country the size of a large golf course get dragged into it? The Austro-Prussian War of 1866, sometimes called the 7 Weeks' War because it lasted exactly that long, was essentially a power struggle for control of the German-speaking world. On one side, you had Austria, the traditional heavyweight of Central European politics, led by Emperor Franz Joseph. On the other, Prussia, the ambitious upstart in the north, led by King Wilhelm I, but really driven by his iron-willed chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck wanted to unify the German states under Prussian leadership, and Austria was the biggest obstacle standing in his way. The trigger was a dispute over 2 territories called Schleswig and Holstein, which Austria and Prussia had jointly taken from Denmark 2 years earlier. But the real issue was much bigger. This was about who would dominate Central Europe for generations to come. When war broke out, every member of the German Confederation had to pick a side. Most of the southern and smaller states, including Liechtenstein, sided with Austria. It was the safe, traditional choice. Austria was their neighbor, their protector, the established power. Prussia was the disruptor, so Liechtenstein lined up behind Austria, assembled its 80 soldiers under the command of an officer named Peter Rheinberger, and sent them marching south, into war. Technically, this brings us to maybe the most practical question of this whole story. What exactly were 80 men supposed to accomplish in a war involving nearly 500,000 soldiers on both sides? The answer is, mercifully, not much. Liechtenstein's contingent was not sent to the front lines. Nobody expected 80 men to charge Prussian artillery positions. Instead, they were assigned to guard duty in the Austrian Alps, specifically in the Tyrol region near some of the key mountain passes along the Italian border. You see, Austria was fighting a 2-front war. Prussia was pressing from the north, and Italy, which had allied with Prussia, was pushing from the south, eager to seize Austrian-held territories like Venetia. So Liechtenstein's 80 soldiers were posted to the mountains to help monitor and defend Alpine passes. It was real military duty with a real strategic purpose. Those mountain routes mattered, but in practice, the Italian front in their sector stayed quiet. No enemy forces came through their area. No shots were fired, no engagements took place. Meanwhile, the actual decisive action was happening hundreds of miles away. On July 3, 1866, Prussian forces crushed the Austrian army at the Battle of Königgrätz in Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic. It was one of the largest battles in European history up to that point, involving nearly 500,000 troops. Prussia's superior needle guns and brilliant tactical planning overwhelmed Austrian forces in a single devastating day. Within weeks, Austria sued for peace. The war was over almost as quickly as it had begun, 7 weeks. And through all of it, Liechtenstein's 80 soldiers sat in the mountains, watched the passes, dealt with summer thunderstorms, and waited for something to happen. Nothing did. All right, the question you've been waiting for: who was number 81? When the war ended and the order came to return home, Liechtenstein's contingent packed up and began the march back to their tiny principality. All 80 soldiers present and accounted for. Not a single casualty, not a single injury, not even a single case of serious illness, which in the 1860s was practically a miracle by itself. Disease killed far more soldiers than bullets did in most 19th century conflicts. But when the column arrived home, there weren't 80 men in it. There were 81. The identity of the 81st man is where the historical record gets a little hazy, and honestly, that only makes the story better. The most widely cited account says he was an Austrian liaison officer, someone who had been assigned to coordinate with the Liechtenstein contingent during their deployment. Over the weeks of shared guard duty, shared meals, shared boredom in the mountains, this Austrian officer had apparently bonded so thoroughly with the Liechtenstein soldiers that when it came time to go home, he simply went home with them. Not to Austria, to Liechtenstein. Some versions of the story describe him as a friend they picked up along the way. Others suggest he was a deserter from the Austrian side who found better company among the 80 men from the tiny principality. A few historians have speculated he might have been an Italian defector, though this version has less support. Whatever his exact identity, the result is the same, and it's the detail that has kept this story alive for over 150 years. Liechtenstein sent 80 men to war and got 81 back. They literally profited from the experience. In human terms, they came out ahead. Now here's a question with a surprisingly poignant answer. What happened next? 2 years later, in 1868, Liechtenstein dissolved its army entirely. Gone. The 80-man military was disbanded, and the principality declared itself permanently neutral. The reasons were partly financial. Maintaining even a tiny army costs money, and Liechtenstein's government decided those funds could be better spent elsewhere. But the timing is hard to ignore. The Austro-Prussian War had reshuffled the entire political landscape of Central Europe. The German Confederation that had required Liechtenstein to maintain an army in the first place was dissolved after Austria's defeat. Prussia went on to form the North German Confederation and eventually the German Empire. Liechtenstein's obligation to contribute soldiers simply evaporated. And so the principality made a choice that, in hindsight, looks remarkably wise. They chose peace. Permanent, deliberate, structural peace. Liechtenstein has not fought in a war since. Not in World War I, not in World War II, not in anything. They remain one of the few countries on the planet without a standing military, relying instead on a small national police force. Their last military engagement was the one where they made a friend and came home. There's something quietly profound buried in this comedy. 80 men walked into a war, found absolutely no reason to hurt anyone, spent their weeks sharing food and conversation with a stranger, and brought him home like a stray cat that followed them back from the Alps. In the middle of a conflict that reshaped Europe, that killed thousands, that toppled alliances and redrew borders, 80 guys from the world's smallest army just made a buddy. Maybe that says something about what happens when the pressure to fight isn't really there. When the cannons are far away and the mountain air is clean, and the person sitting across the campfire from you is just another human being with nothing to do but talk. War is supposed to be about enemies. But apparently, when you send 80 men into one and nobody shows up to fight them, they'll find a friend instead. I think that's worth sitting with for a minute. If this story made you smile or think or both, consider sticking around. I tell stories like this one regularly, the strange corners of history that textbooks skip right over. Subscribing is the easiest way to make sure the next one finds you. I'll see you in the next video.